Hello and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. Well, joined with me in studio to discuss their latest Persecuted and Forgotten report, which looks at the issue of persecuted Christians around the world. The report is put together by Aid to the Church in Need. I have Michael Kelly of Aid to the Church in Need Ireland. There's a lot in this report, Michael. It's very comprehensive, but let's just start off with the broader question of Christian persecution. Is it getting better or worse?
Yeah, and one of the reasons why we called this Persecuted and Forgotten question mark was because wherever you go in the world and you meet people who are experiencing persecution because of their faith in Christ, the one thing they say to us Christians in the West who have it relatively easily, they say, have you forgotten about us? And the simple fact is, Wendy, the situation has got worse. We looked at 18 countries in this report, and in 17 of them, the situation has gotten worse. In one, Vietnam, it's gotten marginally better because the Vietnamese Communist authorities recently established diplomatic relations with the Holy See. So we see that as a way forward that's going to lead to greater freedom of worship, for example, and greater freedom of religion in Vietnam. But the broad picture is, unfortunately, a depressing one. The clampdown on religious freedom, particularly against Christians, is getting worse around the world, to the extent of which now we say that 1 in 7 Christians live under persecution or extreme hostility for their faith.
How do you quantify if the situation has gotten worse or better? What sort of parameters are you looking at?
So we look at things like upsurge in violence, we look at imprisonment, because there's a very different picture, but broadly speaking, we can categorise clampdown on religious freedom now into two broad categories. On the one hand, you have countries, particularly now in West Africa, that are experiencing Islamist insurgencies that want to rid the entire area of their traditional Christian communities. So that's one aspect, and it's interesting to note geopolitically that that has really moved its focus from the Middle East to West Africa. So, we've heard about Islamic State being largely defeated in Iraq, being largely defeated in Syria, but that ideology has really moved now to Africa in forces like Boko Haram and lots of others like that. And then the other side where we see it getting worse is in repressive regimes that see religion, particularly Christianity, as a threat to the order of that regime, as a threat to the control that they have. Quite often because missionaries, priests, religious, lay catechists are speaking out against injustice. And one of the countries that we've added to this report for the first time, unfortunately and depressingly, because we consider it a traditional Catholic country, is Nicaragua, where we know that the church has been undergoing intense pressure there from the government.
Michael, one of the things that is probably recurring when we talk about persecuted Christians is there just isn't enough attention given to it from our own government, from governments around the world. Like, to take one example, I would say for the vast majority of people watching, they would be shocked to hear that 5,000 Christians were killed last year in Nigeria alone.
Yeah, I think we think of it as a thing of the past. It's sobering to reflect on the fact that more Christians have been killed in the last 100 years for their faith than in the entire 1900 years of Christianity before that. When I was a little child, I grew up reading, the Far East magazine, and I heard these stories of these heroic priests in communist China. But somehow I think in our comfort now in the West, we've begun to think that those are things of the past. And that's why in Aid to the Church in Need, we're asking parishes to reflect on this, to kind of hear these stories that are there, hear the fact that, we might grumble on a winter's morning that it's very, very cold and the heating isn't on in the church because Father's trying to save some money. But there's parts of the world where people undergo real hardships for their faith. And one of the most beautiful things, when you meet these people, they're not put upon, they're not going around saying, woe is me. The joy that they have in their faith is really something that is very, very humbling to experience. But you're right about the lack of focus around this, even in international human rights language, when we talk about all kinds of minority rights, because in most situations where Christians are persecuted or discriminated against, it's where they are in a minority. We find it very, very hard to get them to speak about the minority rights of Christians. We hear lots of conversation, and quite rightly so, about gender equality and equality for other minorities. but the Christian community in particular, we find it very, very hard to get the international human rights community to coalesce around that language.
What's behind that? Why is it that if you were talking about, as you say, another minority, it might get more attention or more headlines, more political pressure? Why are Christians persecuted and forgotten?
Yeah, I think mostly it's not a malicious thing in any way. I mean, sometimes people suggest that it's because it's Christians. I think from a Western lens, from a Western viewpoint, we can perhaps only conceptualize Christianity as this powerful, dominant force. I mean, if you look at the history of contemporary Ireland, for example, that's the only way in which people can see the church. They can't in any way see Christians as being a minority or being a hard-pressed minority or people who might be discriminated against. So some of it, I think, is just that inability to actually see that perhaps the traditional privilege that Christians enjoyed in the West, that isn't the case in parts of the Middle East, in Africa, in all parts of the developing world, in totalitarian regimes where the church, where religious freedom has always been seen as a threat to those regimes. So I think a lot of our focus goes on maybe minorities that we can very, very easily see that were traditionally not treated in our own culture the way that they ought to have been, and we just see Christianity as this dominant force. So I think really we need to try to go back to basics on that, and that's why one of the reasons in this report is we tell stories, we tell case studies. And I mean, one of the case studies, for example, is a priest from Nigeria who, please God, we hope to have in Ireland next year telling his story. And he was kidnapped by Boko Haram, the Islamist group there in northern Nigeria. And when you hear his story, I mean, this is a man who they took out almost every day, and they got to dig his grave, telling him that today was going to be the day that he was going to die. But thank God, after a long process of negotiations, he was released. But this is a daily reality in Nigeria. I mean, priests are kidnapped in Nigeria almost every week. Lay people as well, kidnapped from schools very often. And as you say, that chilling figure of at least 5,000 Christians killed for their faith in Nigeria last year alone.
Michael, what do you hope this report will achieve? What would you like people to do with it?
I really hope, that in our parishes and communities around the country, we have really wonderful Laudato Si groups, we have really wonderful justice and peace groups, all of these groups that are hearing, the cry of the earth, the cry of oppressed people around the world, that religious freedom, and particularly the oppression of Christians, because Christians are the most discriminated against religious group in the world. Because sometimes people say to us, oh, why don't you concentrate on, Muslims who are being mistreated in India, for example, or Hindus who are being mistreated in Pakistan? Well, the first thing we say is that protecting the rights of one minority always enhances the rights of other minority communities. But we would really love that if parishes and faith communities, and indeed religious congregations who have a great heart for these kind of things, would take on in particular the cause of religious freedom and the cause of persecuted Christians, and first and foremost pray for them, but secondly, advocate on their behalf and hear their stories, because right back to why we've used the word forgotten ? In the title of the report, very often these communities, when I go there, they say to me, have you all forgotten about us in the West? Have you all forgotten that we're clinging to the faith here in very, very difficult circumstances? And sometimes I have to hold my hands up and say, I think we are a little bit guilty of that charge. We're guilty of a little bit of blindness around it.
Well, this report hopefully will take the blinkers off for all of us. Michael, thank you so much for joining us on iCatholic today. The report is called Persecuted and Forgotten, and you can find out more and indeed support the very important work of Aid to the Church in Need by going to acnireland.org.